Bandai just dropped a massive announcement about the future of the Digimon TCG, and I am super excited to talk about it. They are introducing an official mulligan rule in Japan starting May 1st that will be implemented across the card game. This is something I'm going to go over in a later video, discussing kind of the intricacies of this new mulligan and how to optimize our ratios for deck building for it. But more importantly, I want to talk about the next thing they had to announce, which was this new counter timing that they are introducing into the game, and the inclusion of what people are calling hand traps. Effects that you can activate during your opponent's turn to stop some of their plays and interrupt their plays. I think this is an excellent change for the game, something I'm incredibly excited about, and I'm going to tell you why today. Anyway, let's get right into it. Do know that some of this is going to be speculation, as they have basically outlined the mechanic, but we're not sure of all of the little details or intricacies. But from what we know, I think we have a good understanding of how this mechanic is going to work. I want to talk about one of the criticisms before we get into this proper, and that's people kind of dooming that this mechanic spells the end of the game, that power creep's gone way too high, hand traps ruin the game. And a lot of this perspective comes from people who have played Yu-Gi-Oh! And remember this old school style of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where people kind of trade back and forth, and eventually the game evolved into what it is now, which is this combo heavy, crazy game with incredibly long turns and a lot of disruption, and a lot of people trying to disrupt people from their hand and stuff like that. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not a bad game, first off. It is one of those popular games in the world, and this is a playstyle that appeals to a lot of players. There's a lot of skill and depth, and probably one of the most advanced games there is in the market. That said, people who play Digimon aren't really trying to get this playstyle, and I can see where this concern comes from. But these cards are not the same. They are not the same as hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! First off, there are no traps in Digimon to begin with. Because there are no defensive options, this doesn't compare with Yu-Gi-Oh! Which already had a form of defensive options and a way to counterplay against those defensive options. In fact, most games have a way to defend yourself from your hand using specific cards. Digimon, on the other hand, has significantly lacked in defensive mechanics. If you think about what has been available in Digimon, there are only really 3 defensive mechanics overall. That's going to be blocking, recovery, and security bombs. Blocking is something that is easy for opponents to interact with. Our opponents are able to remove our threats before we are able to use our blockers. This was made very apparent in BT9, where a lot of the OTK decks simply just removed the blockers out of the way and had no trouble blowing through an opponent's security, even though they had blockers or defensive Digimon on the field. Things like Grandest Quaguan would suspend and swing over it with piercing. Things like Metal Gurumon would bounce it. Things like Alphamon would delete it. Blockers really are hard to stick onto the board and actually remain a defensive threat, and are not the most efficient forms of defense. Next up is recovery, and recovery is a very strong defensive mechanic, but is very yellow specific. No other color has access to this mechanic unless they have some kind of dual color splash, such as Gatomon or some niche blue cards like Angemon and Shakomon. And then finally is security bombs, and while we can build our deck strategically to try and optimize the number of security bombs we have in our deck, security bombs at their core are a luck-based mechanic. We are still hoping for things to be in our security to defend us and save us in any given instance. They are a core part of the game, and we are expected to see security bombs every once in a while in our games, but they're not something we can strategically play with if we do not know they are available. This new mechanic, however, plays directly as a defensive mechanic that any color can use in its own way, and has unique effects for each color. They specifically added a new counter timing window that is going to be after your opponent attacks and declares their when attacking effects, but before the opposing player chooses to block. This means that some of our defensive measures might be warping out blockers that can now block unexpectedly, or deleting weak Digimon, or suspending your opponent's other Digimon so that after your opponent does their checks, you can't swing for game. There's a lot of different utility cards coming out, and I think this is super excellent for the game. On top of this, the specific mechanic they revealed is a very unique kind of card called Ace. Ace cards have a unique trait that they are all undercosted to play, have the new defensive mechanic in the form of Blast Digivolve, which means you can Digivolve for free during your opponent's turn after they declare an attack, during the counter timing window, and then activate their when Digivolving effect during the opponent's turn. They also have a keyword called Overflow, and this is, I think, the most crucial part about these cards that's going to make them a very skill-testing mechanic for the player base. Overflow is a drawback. If this Digimon is removed from the field in any way, you will lose a certain amount of memory. That means that if we are careless with our defensive uses, our opponents could delete these Digimon, bounce these Digimon, send these Digimon to our trash or to our top of our security, or even de-Digivolve a Digimon that has this trait, and we will be massively punished, giving our opponent extra time to extend their plays. This is kind of made up for by the fact that these cards are generally undercosted, having crazy things like 4 cost level 5s and 6 cost level 6s, but even then, this drawback is massive. There is a lot of efficient removal in the Digimon TCG, so because of this means that you have to be very careful when you use your defense to try and secure different positions. Also, from what we understand, this mechanic works in the inheritable of the Digimon and as the Digimon itself, so you can't Digivolve or remove this effect from your card, and it always is going to have this drawback. If you want to build this Digimon into a standard line, it's going to be very costly if your opponent deals with the Digimon that you built, which means they're much better suited to be used for this defensive purpose. Now I want to focus for a bit about these cards' counter timing. This makes us a very specific time to use this mechanic. It's not going to be the kind of gunslinger way that something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic handles its instants and trap cards. In those games, you can effectively use your countering cards basically whenever you want, as long as you meet the card's condition. Some cards have a very freeing condition of basically your opponent has a card on the field. If you want to see this in action, the game Master Duel allows you to play a card called Max C, which you can basically activate at any given time. Look at how much the time the video game tries to ask you if you would like to use this card, and you will see just how many opportunities there are to play any given card in any situation in some other kind of game. Because this has a very specific timing counter, which only happens when our opponent attacks us, we only have this one opportunity to respond. We're not going to be massively disruptive to our opponent's turns. Our opponent's not going to have to ask us, is this okay if I do this? Is this okay if I do this? Is this okay if I do this? We simply have a specific opportunity when we'd be allowed to generally block like we normally do if we want to use this. This means that this counter mechanic works much more like something like Dragon Ball Super, One Piece, or Vanguard, where we're essentially defending ourselves after our opponent chooses to attack us. As of right now, Bandai has already showed us the various different ways in basically every color that this mechanic is going to work. And I am super excited to see the development of this mechanic in the future. I think this is going to be a great change for the game. The game has desperately needed some defensive options, especially as OTK decks have risen to the forefront. I think this is going to be super healthy for the game. There's finally going to be answers for things that are very toxic and uninteractive. Now we have a way to interact with someone just simply bringing out a stack and trying to swing for everything we have with little response other than praying that our security works. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, if you liked what I had to say, if you have anything else to say about this new counter mechanic, let me know and do the YouTube thing down below. And I'll check you guys out in the next one. Peace out.